G'day, welcome to the GitGud.CG podcast. This is a podcast where two CG artists document their journey of getting good and sharing some of the knowledge along the way for you to learn. My name's Jayden and this is Kris.
Hi.
What's going on?
Oh, I am having a bit of a week. It was sort of like a back to basics week where everything just sort of felt a little bit too hard basket. And, when you've got two competing advices in your head where one's saying portfolio work should be your absolute best work and you should spend as much time polishing it as possible, but then on the other shoulder you've got
go on Reddit.
No, actually that is another problem that can occur, but generally for me it's the conflicting advice of the more rapidly you iterate, so like the smaller things you do faster, the more you're going to learn. And so learning versus portfolio have really been in conflict with me this week. So what it ended up meaning was that there was a lot of moving around of, animation puppets in space and not a whole lot of animation happening.
Hey, oh my god, samesies. We're totally twins on that.
Oh my god, samesies.
I was working on, this project, and I just got yesterday, I was just staring at it. I'm like, you know what? I'm sick of this. I was just over it. I spent too much time on it. I thought, nah, it's time to move on. So,
or at least shelve it for a while. Put it in the cooler.
Yeah, chuck her in the cooler, see how she goes. But I'm just I'll come back to it. But I've decided, instead of doing like small environments, I'm going to, where it's like a hero prop and supporting assets and all that sort of stuff. I'm just going to focus on doing just individual props, and I'm going to give myself a 3-day deadline just to pump them out, just to get the process down pat.
I think if you took all of the recordings of this podcast so far and you put them together strategically, you could probably get a pretty good up down of us being like, oh yeah, no, things are working really well, it's all failed, it's mud, it's awful, oh no, it's going pretty good actually, oh no, I had to readdress it because it was
it's just, it's basically that, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm doing this, I'm not going to do that thing I was doing before,
because that was obviously a mistake. Take our advice, by the way, it's really top quality.
Anyway, so I'm doing the thing now that I said I wasn't going to do anymore, and that thing that I said I was going to do is actually a bad idea, and oh, by the way, I've switched again.
And there's a psychiatrist out there listening, just writing prescriptions and mailing them to us.
We do have a mail-in bag where if you have any questions, topics that you want us to talk about, you can leave a comment, or we have an email, krisandjayden@gmail.com. Like, comment, subscribe.
That is virtual mail, so you cannot, in fact, send us any physical goods, and we wouldn't want it to do anyway.
Unless it's a prescription, then we can get that filled out.
Well, you might be interested in that, but...
Valium, please. Anyway, so what's today's topic, Senior Kris?
Well, my friend, we were going to go over process. How you feeling about process at the moment?
Process.
I think as far as process goes, we can talk about it in that both of us, I think, have been through a few processes lately, and we can probably find a through line, a cross-section of like what works, what doesn't work, some of the problems with some approaches, maybe. Do you think that would be interesting?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I feel like coming in as the authority on process at this point is a little bit hypocritical, to say the least, because I know that I've changed my process quite profoundly recently, and maybe it's worth like digging into some of that. But it's sort of like, here's the current process, asterisk, your mileage may vary.
Alright guys, this is what you do to get good. You're gonna come in and you're gonna do these exact things that I'm doing, and it's gonna get you good. You're gonna love it. It's gonna be great. Then 1 week later, so I completely backflipped on every single thing I just said last week.
I would hate to be someone who took that advice. Jeez. But no, Look, we came into this project, we were very clear, it is a documentary process, warts and all.
Yeah. Lots of warts.
Hence the prescriptions.
So, Kris, do you want to start us off on what you've got to say on process?
Yeah, well, for starters, I think both you and I have a very different approach. Would you say that that's, like, I know we do different styles of CGI, like different disciplines, but the way we actually approach breaking down the work, I think that's possibly coming at it from two ends of the same stick, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'd say yours is very planning based. You sort of plan everything out, and then when it gets to the actual doing, you don't. And then and for me, it's opposite. Zero planning, start doing. Both leads to failure.
If we could somehow join up like some sort of Voltron type situation.
Autobots. No, wait. That doesn't... No,
wrong one.
That.
Yeah, it's the one with the robot cats. Don't worry about it. Nerd stuff.
Nerd. But yeah, so what's your process? Is it very front end orientated?
Well, I've always been a list creator. So I think that's something that both of us do have in common, which is why I think it's like two ends of the same stick. Because we do both create lists. I think just let's call it the resolution of those lists changes. Because I think I'm very much like step by step by step down to like the next thing that I will do in the process. Whereas I think what you tend to do is just sort of a couple of general guidelines.
Yeah, look, I haven't actually always been a list person, and I only really started doing lists like maybe last year, probably. And even then, I didn't really stick to it. I started doing lists again probably around the middle of this year when I quit my job, and I thought, I've got to be productive.
How's that going?
Well, I stopped doing lists for about a month. And I started doing it for a few days, and I stopped again for like another couple of weeks. But
what would you call that phenomenon where you know there's something that helps with the problem you're having, but you resist implementing it anyway because ...
Yeah, it's called the dumb.
I've got a case of the dumbs, doctor.
Yeah, I just got a big case of the old dumbs.
Well, yeah. Well, to just sort of unpack that a little bit more, I have always been a list person, and I've actually had a radical shift in the way that I'm actually working in that regard, because instead of just doing lists now...
You're a radical listist.
I'm a radical listener. Like, comment, and subscribe.
Like, comment, subscribe.
The way I'm doing it now is that what I tended to do before, I would just sort of brain dump onto a page, and the first thing I thought of was the most top of mind, so that's the thing that I would do first, which I still do as like a top level when I sit down to do the work, but something that I've actually been doing beyond that, because I found that I was constantly creating the same list over and over again just to keep track of it in my head. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, if you write something down, it makes you more likely to actually do it.
But then I would get confused in the process, right? Like, I get to a point where something wasn't working, or I didn't account for something, and the list I'd written didn't include those nuances, so I had to then sit down, write the list again, and include the new information, which means that the process wasn't actually written down. The process was...
Wait, do you mean from the previous day? You do this the next day?
The next day, or just whenever I sort of like, get up Confusion Creek. Like, you know when you're working on something and you've solved a bunch of problems that you've just run into that you hadn't accounted for, you feel like you've achieved something, but there's nothing on the list you can actually check off.
Yeah. Like, there'll be plenty of times where I'll just have my list like super rough. It'll just be, game art, eat, put washing in washing machine, hang washing out, fold washing, put washing away. I would literally do only game art, I'll tick that off and I feel like, oh yeah, I achieved so much today in the game arts. Anyway, I only did one thing on my list today out of 20 things.
And that's the thing. Like, I think a general list like that is good for habit building, which is another topic, but it's really important. The lists that I use are more about like trying to figure out where you are in that process to try and get a more realistic view of, you know, how close to the end you are and what you need to start thinking about.
Some advice I heard about lists was you plan the day that you want to have in terms of what is realistically possible.
Yeah.
So it's like you schedule in like, you know, your responsibility stuff of, you know, washing your dishes and, you know, feeding your cat or whatever. And then you know, do whatever else in between that. And
yeah, and you need to account for, like, if you've got a doctor's appointment, you're going to get less done, and having the expectation of still getting the same amount of stuff done is silly.
Yeah, and so I
was just going to say that
doing your... It's my turn.
Okay.
Not really, but it's. I found that it's good if you do your schedule the day beforehand. And I've only done this like once or twice. I really need to do this. I'm just too lazy in the evening. That's the only problem. But if you do that, then you schedule in when you're going to wake up, and that actually increases the likelihood that you will get up at that time.
Yeah, no, certainly, and that's something that I was going to say is that recently I've changed up. Whereas before I would sit down and the first thing I would do as part of the process would be write the list.
Yeah.
Now I've got sort of like a layered list system where I spend about a week looking at the projects that I've got coming up, breaking them down into sort of as minute detail as possible. I don't always use that detail, but it's just nice to sort of like account for the project and understand where I think all the friction points are going to be. Then I'll make this meta list, like a big list of all that stuff, and then put that to the side as the project list, and then separate out my day list. And then on my day list, I have a certain amount of tasks that I can complete, and then from all of the sort of project lists that I've made, I pull them in, and then I try to accomplish some of those things in the daily list.
Yeah, nah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I do think I need to have a higher resolution of lists as well, similar to that. But I just if I overlist myself, then let's go. No, fuck it. And just play video games or like go on Reddit. Like,
yeah.
If I overlist myself, then it's just like it's like almost creating a prison, and my brain just rebels to that. So
you become rigid, right? It becomes rigid. You've quantified everything, and so now it's just work. There's no anticipation of surprise. It's just gonna sit there until you do it.
Yeah, and so I think that like a broader list helps me, but I do think I need to go into a little bit more detail. So I have like, you know, my time blocks of, you know, this is what I'm doing in these days. And then, you know, maybe in those actual time blocks, schedule out what I'm going to do in that time.
Well, what I've actually found works really well is with those big meta lists, I print them out, I stick them up on my whiteboard, and I've got this big black, you know, Sharpie marker. And whenever I knock something off the main list, I run the Sharpie marker through it. It's really cathartic.
Yeah.
And because I've got both of the projects that I'm working on fully itemized and put up there, I look at it more regularly. So I've got a more consistent view of what I'm actually working on. And it's harder to then do that too hard basket thing where you just don't think about it and therefore it's not a problem.
Yeah, I find it so satisfying, right? When you get to tick something off, but not only when you get to tick something off, but when you get to tick like, you know, 5 things off at once. So I'll break one task down into multiple steps just for the sake of just being like, yeah. Sorry to anyone that was listening with headphones then.
I'll fix it in post.
I was just looking at my mic peak and be like, Whoops.
But
Yeah, you get what I mean.
it's very satisfying. And what I've started doing actually is really just radically quantifying all of those things and then just sort of putting them to the side but keeping them visible, because for me they disappear if you stop thinking about them. So I render them in bright colors and post them up around my office. But then, like you were saying, if you do the list the night before, you are more likely to approach it because you've already started thinking about it and you're mentally prepared to approach it, right?
And it also just means you're more likely going to get up at a certain time, because if you don't plan when you're going to get up, like say if you've got a roughly similar time when you get up, that's fine. But if you actually write down when you're going to get up, then you're more likely to do it. But, with that said, I've tried that plenty of times. And I'll be like, all right, I'm going to get up at, 5:30, and then I'm going to write that down in my book, and then I'll, schedule in, 5:28 just to, be a bit, hardcore, and then next minute it's just like 6:30.
Yeah. I mean, I'm struggling with that at the moment because I've had a pretty bad sleep schedule lately, and I'm actively trying to pull my bedtime earlier so that I can get up earlier, and I'm actually trialing what's called Biphasic Sleeping. That might be a bit much to get into on this podcast right now, but it's mainly the idea that you get up a bit earlier, you do some really focused stuff when you've got the space and time to do it, when nobody else is around and there's no other demands on your time. But then after you've done that, you just go back to sleep for a little while, and then you get up later in the morning.
Yeah. I that's probably a bit, a bit too off the beaten trail for today, but yeah, let me know how that goes. Good luck with that.
Yeah, we'll leave a seed there. I'm actively implementing it at the moment. It's sort of in that phase where you're building a habit where you do it some days and then other days it just goes catastrophically wrong. But I'm actually
time for my 10:30 nap, and it's 4 p.m. and I'm a nocturnal now.
Well, I mean, alarms do help, but for instance, I got my first Pfizer jab the other day. Yeah. And so I was trying to get up at a particular time, and my body was just nope.
Oh god, yeah, that happened to me. Sorry, that happened to me this morning. It was I meant to pod with Kris at 7, and I want to get some blender done beforehand, but I can't be stuffed.
That's the thing. The accountability helps as well. It's actually why I'm considering doing a bit of streaming or something like that, because that's early days obviously, but the fact that there might even be somebody there that's possibly waiting to see what you're doing, even if that's a complete fabrication of your mind, it gives you that extra level of responsibility where you might actually just get dragged into the task.
Yeah. So is streaming something that you want to talk about now? Is that something you want to announce and talk about with the fine listeners of the pod?
I'll drop a seed. We'll see how we go. I still need to get the setup sorted out. It's probably going to be pretty ghetto initially, but it is something I'm looking at doing just because at the moment visibility is sort of the only currency, because there isn't really a lot else going on.
Yeah. So anyway, what is your process when you're starting a creative project? I'm not talking about animation specifically, but do you think that there are some universal process skills or approaches that are good for pretty much anything?
Yeah.
Anything creative?
I actually do, and I touched on it I think a little bit before, in that I think it's really worth seeing the start and seeing the end, and then at whatever level of detail you're comfortable with, figuring out what every step is in between those 2 points. Because I feel especially with a creative thing, if you start with no goal in mind, yes, that's how a lot of fine art is produced, but you're not going to achieve what you set out to do unless you know what that looks like. And so I think quantifying what it is you're actually working on is quite important.
Yes, and I think that can be done in so many different ways, whether it's, your old favorite, I gotta do a list. But then there's also, you know, the actual more conceptual part of it where it's like, say, the list. So I think for me, I think that when you're starting a new project, if you conceptualize that project to the best of your ability and that it is as clear as possible, then that's when you're going to do really well. And I think that is something that is universal across the creative field. That it doesn't matter if it's animation, if it's architecture, if it's game art. But if you really put in the time to do, say, the storyboarding or, you know, whatever else there is in animation, or you
sketches and
sketches
and expression sheets.
Exactly. And then there's also, say, for game art, for me, when I'm doing game art, it's like, if I really just nut out the process of the concept, then I'm much more likely to actually nail it, because I think we've talked about this off mic, but it's like once you do a really solid concept, you've made all of those really broad stroke decisions. You don't have to make those broad stroke decisions on the fly. You've created...
The only choices you're making at that point are, you know, unexpected things that you've run into, whereas you've already made all the broad creative decisions. And that's actually folds back into the second thing I do, which is the goal setting, the actual goal setting, not the what does finished look like, but like I usually set an artistic goal, a practical goal, like a learning goal, and then usually something a bit more ephemeral, like what's it trying to say, or why am I doing this thing?
I think that is a seriously understated part of the process, where people just... There might be a bit of ephemeral sort of reasoning behind it, but there's not much other than I want to do the thing. There's not much meaning to it.
And that's the thing that actually gets people jobs, though, is if they don't have any creative sort of drive, if they're happy to make the thing for the thing's sake and have somebody else impose upon them an artistic direction, that's what makes a technician. So I think maybe that particular goal setting could be optional depending on what you're doing. Because if you're just a cog in a machine of a studio or something, they want your opinion on, like, does it serve the project? And it will obviously depend on your, like, level of seniority. But they don't really want your creative vision behind it. So I think that's more to do with, like, personal projects and stuff that you are driving artistically. But what I would say is that artistic result, that choice, has to come from somewhere. So if it's not you, someone above you better be making that choice, you know?
I think that I'm coming from experience on architecture here with this one, but what will happen in architecture is, like, you have someone higher up come up with the broad strokes of the project. They will do they'll do the concept things and generally how things are going to go, and it gets passed down to you know, the bottom feeder, underling scum, and
master has Dobby a project.
Basically, and you're there sort of detailing, documenting, doing a lot of the drawings in terms of, like, more technical drawings, but there is an expectation that you are actually making the creative final decisions. Yes, they're very technical in terms of, like, you're looking up, you know, certain beam types to use, or certain, you know, steel or whatever, where it's like, okay, this is this part does not feel creative, but there is a creativity in that. The end result greatly depends on that.
Right? You need something to run it against. Does it or does it not serve the goal? And if somebody above you is not serving you that creative context, you have to give yourself that context. Otherwise, you don't know, out of all of the choices you can make, what the correct choice will be.
Yeah, and so when they hand it down to you, they have this expectation that you are going to have some creative input on, you know, how this handrail is going to be designed, or, you know, how this space is going to be. They've roughed out the space, but, you know, it's your job to come in and figure out what it's going to be like, or what the detail along, you know, this certain strip where it's going to be. Or you know, that they kind of have the expectation that, you know, you'll look at the design and go, oh, actually, maybe the design could change in this way. It's...
But to me, that's a bit of a failure of the management in that case, because they really should have a vision for what they want it to be in the first place. And they're trying to communicate that to you in order to have it filtered through your skill set. If they're making decisions based upon what you serve them all of the time, that kind of feels like they're just sort of playing it by feel.
Well, in architecture, it's very much like the conceptual drawings are very... Like, you have to keep an eye on the detail, but the reality is that it's impossible to have things fleshed out. You'll be... There will, some creative decisions will be made right up until, the keys are handed over. And that's the sort of thing where, like, someone else has taken over the project and, you're at the point where you're choosing carpet tiles and you've got to sort of make creative decisions over that.
I think non-ideally that happens with every creative project, though.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like those micro details where, like, the technicians, they do get a bit of creative decision. It's just, it's not the broad stroke stuff. The technicians, they do get some creative decision. It's just they don't get the broad stroke creative decision. There'll be someone's higher up, they make the broader strokes and they will have some indications of the smaller detail things. But then the underlings, they work within the constraints set out to them by the concept.
Yeah, and that's just sort of the componentization of a project. Whereas if it's your project, you will be making both of those choices, the macro and the micro choices, and you'll be responsible for that. So if you're laying out that project, you do need to start with those broad strokes and then work your way down to those more minor creative decisions. It's all happening as a component of the one person. And so I think after you've set those goals for what you want the project to be, sort of circling back around to process in what we're doing, I will normally run it past... Like, this is something that I do that I don't think a lot of other people do, so take it with a grain of salt, but I run it past my goals for more broad life. Like, I'm about to spend 20, 30 hours on this thing. Is this a valuable use of my time towards the goals that I've set?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably not a bad thing to do, to be honest. It's something I should probably do, where it's like, okay, I'm about to, spend a week on this thing. Is this going to take me a week in the direction of where I want to go, or is it going to take me a week in a different direction? It's going to take me backwards because... Am
I just doing it because I think somebody else wants to see it? Because I want to impress them and get a job?
Yeah.
That's the one that really gets me, because, like, that gives me that external accountability, but at the same time it undercuts everything that I sort of see as, like, a creative sort of strength.
You find that running past things, running it past your general life goals, you think that is that's pulling you back?
Well, no, running it past my life goals and deciding that if I've been doing a thing, it's only for the benefit of somebody else. Like, if I'm justifying my presence, if I'm saying, look at this thing, I can be where you are because I paid to play, that's not worth making something, because you're never going to find the same internal drive to actually bring it through to a proper conclusion if what you're actually doing is sort of trying to figure out what that person wants to see. It's sort of different to when you've got a client and you're figuring out what they might like to see. It's more about the spec work element, where you're like, okay, so I want to be over there. What does that person want? Rather than what do I want to make so that I attract the people who like what I make. Because that's how you get into trouble. Because it's like, and then they're like, oh yeah, this is great. Can you do it again? You're like, ah.
I think that's probably the difference between looking for a job / also freelancing, but then also online content creator.
Yeah.
Where it's, you do the thing to get to a said job. And, if I'm wrong on this, someone, let me know in the comments, but, you do a certain thing with the aim of pleasing someone else to get a job. But then on the flip side, you just do the thing you want to do so that you attract the people that are actually interested in the thing that you genuinely want to do and the things that you do.
I would argue that if you're serving the right clients, if you're getting the right jobs, it should be the same for both, and it should be just you're making what you're good at making. It should be on them to validate whether or not what you do is what they want, you know?
I think it's also probably a bit of, no matter what you do, if it's something you want to live off, you should probably figure out your target, either target client or target audience or target employer. So I think, come to think of it, you're probably always doing something with the goal of, appealing to someone.
Well, I guess, but I guess it depends on how broad that definition is, because, for instance, one of the principles of animation is appeal. So, appealing to whom? The only person who it can really be appealing to is you. It has to be run past your own sentiments and creativity, and you have to be like, yeah, this works. Or, yeah, this doesn't work, but it's supposed to be ugly, And that's all going to be very subjective.
Do you think that runs along more of the lines of what appeal in terms of what is more natural? Like, it's just, you look at something, it's like, that just looks wrong. I have no idea about animation, but that looks wrong to me, and it feels wrong, and it's not appealing. It can be something that's ugly, but it's appealing because it seems like it's natural.
I think as far as like human nature goes, intentionality goes a long way. Like if it's ugly by accident, that's a lot more obvious than if it's been crafted to be ugly. Like choices were made here that made it ugly in this way. Like there's been studies where scientists have tried to come up with the most universally appealing image, and usually what they end up with is some form of natural setting with easily accessible water and trees that can be climbed quickly.
Right, so like every Bob Ross picture ever.
Pretty much. But that's not discounting the idea, right? Because people find that very pleasant and relaxing. The whole idea being that humans do have a sort of like lizard brain aesthetic appeal for certain things, but it's sort of the familiar, it's the nostalgic, right?
Yeah.
And so that's still subjective. It's just within a culture, it's going to be less subjective amongst that culture. Which is why I think Pixar always has trouble with their releases, especially now that they're very much trying to target China. Because did you know that, for instance, in Inside Out, when they were serving bad meal, like, stupid healthy meal that only parents like and kids hate, in Western countries it was broccoli. In Eastern countries it was like green peppers or okra or something. And they actually swapped out the models and re-rendered it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because culturally it's the same idea. But the visual to evoke that had to be changed because they don't have the same association with broccoli.
Right, so kids in parts of Asia are like, yeah, give us some broccoli, mate.
I don't think it works the other way around. I think it's more about evoking the negative emotion. That sort of localization, in my opinion, is very effective because when you think about what a production process is, why does the output of that process have to be one thing? We're used to it because it's like, you do a production and then at the end of that production you have a game or a movie or an advertising campaign. But actually, advertising campaign might be a very good idea for this because you do end up with like stuff for TikTok and stuff for the web and stuff for TV, That campaign is across a couple of different mediums. When you look at something like a movie, your understanding is that it's like the movie pops out. Then there's this monolithic thing that is the movie. And then, a bunch of people who sound very much like me on other podcasts say, here's my opinion on this movie and the choices that they made. That sort of breaks down a little bit if there's two versions of the movie. Gives them a whole lot more to talk about, obviously. But it also means that the production itself was the project rather than the movie. Because the movie is just the output of that project.
Right. So you're saying changing things out to benefit or to appeal to other cultures is changing.
It's just choices. It's creative choices. They knew they wanted to evoke that particular emotion.
Yeah.
And so making the choice to evoke that particular emotion was served best by having two versions of the movie.
Yeah, okay. Right, I gotcha.
And it just requires you to take a bit more of a lateral view. Like, there'd be, like, purists out there who are like, no, there has to be one version of this, and this has to be the thing. It's usually people who, you know, have never left their hometown, and they don't understand that the term multicultural melting pot is actually problematic.
There is a world outside of Wagga Wagga.
Or New York. Wherever it is, people have this understanding that their experience is the only experience. And they tend to resist people who come along and say, well, actually, you are one amongst many. And they go, no, 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 no. But that's a tangent. Specifically, I'm saying on processes, I think if you're running it past your goals specifically, you'll end up with better choices and more robust solutions. And I think in a world where we have, what was it, like, the amount of video media that existed in the world 20 years ago is uploaded to YouTube practically every day.
Damn.
Something like that.
Yeah,
and it's like
yeah.
when you've got that much content and data being produced, that's when those choices start to become important. Because it's creating that defining factor, that differentiation. People know what you're about because you've made those choices. You're not leaving it up to interpretation.
Yeah, it's all being pulled together in one big project at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it's because you've made those intentional choices, it is easier for people, regardless of the direction they're coming from, to understand what you were getting at. And the easier it is for people to understand what you were getting at, the more likely it is to be a successful project, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it has more appeal. You're making it appealing, and you're making it more accessible to more people. It's something that more people are going to be able to relate to and enjoy, and you know that's a good thing.
But you're not making it appealing objectively. You're just making it appealing subjectively to more people.
Yeah, it's about knowing your audience.
Yeah, so I think circling back around to the main point, it is about knowing who your target demographic is, who you are trying to serve with the project.
Yeah.
And I think that is important, even if it's just like a portfolio piece or just a little stupid thing you want to throw up on Instagram, whatever it is. I think you do need to target your audience, because otherwise who's it for? Like, nobody's sitting there going, you know, I just really wish there was some random obscure content that I'll have to do a lot of work to find. There's just no content available.
You know, when that happens, that's a pretty good indication of, hey, if you have the desire to, you can fill that void in the market.
If there's a niche, if there's a void, if you can find one, find your people. But what I think is more important is realizing that I don't think there's a difference, like what I was saying before. I think clients and trying to be something like a YouTube creator or something like that, I think the vision has to be the same. You have to find your people, because trying to do anything that's not your natural inclination at this point just means that somebody else will be better at it. And we've got the world to pick from now.
True. Yeah, if you're doing something where it's like, I like it, I suppose, I'm about like 80%, I feel about 80, 75% on it. Someone else is going to come along who feels like, 98% on it. And chances are...
They will sink you because they do that at that level, but they're also looking for that, because if they're that into it, they are putting more time into it, so they will even find the work that you're trying to find quicker. Yeah,
it's just like when they live and breathe it, and you like, you kind of like huff it once every so often.
Yeah, and like this is an idea that came from like a creator I follow on LinkedIn, and he was saying that, like, yeah, if you don't live and breathe this stuff, if you don't wake up thinking about it, if you don't put most of your thought energy into this thing, somebody else is doing that, so they're probably going to win ahead of you. Don't bother doing it if it doesn't, fill all of your boxes, if it doesn't tickle your tickle spot,
Yeah, or at the very least, it's like, if you're doing something you don't like, and you can, not be doing it, then don't do it.
Yeah, which can be like, it's always confronting advice to hear, because you know that there are things that you're doing that you probably should be doing something else, but you're doing it because you feel like you should be doing it.
Yeah.
And when somebody comes along and says, well, maybe don't. If you're not that into it, don't do it. You're like, yeah, but like, stop telling me what to do, because this, I've decided, is the only way forward.
Yeah, I know some people that are like that, and this is just a more general thing where they'll be in a certain situation and they'll go, oh, okay, this solution is the only solution. It's not the best one, but it's just what I have to do. And it's like, I know that I can't change your mind, and you're just going to have to figure that out.
The heavy end, yeah.
Yeah, find that one out the hard way. That with the power of hindsight, and quite often, if there was an opportunity there, it's like, oh, you didn't find that out until the opportunity was gone, mate.
And that's why I think another thing that's very important in process is agility. Always being able to turn very quickly.
Yeah. I think that's... Do you reckon that's something we should dive into in a future pod?
Sure. Especially since we're sort of targeting more of a shorter format. I think we could probably break out agility in decision making. We'll come up with a better title, but I think that would be really interesting.
Making lateral shifts and all that sort of stuff. And
not getting too precious about something with sunk cost fallacy. Like, just because you've put a bunch of effort into it over here doesn't mean... like, just to sort of round out that thought for my own benefit, so it sits there in the back of my head until we talk about it.
Yeah.
The quicker you change your mind when you're doing the wrong thing is actually the faster that you'll get to where you're supposed to be. So not making that decision is taking you further away from your goals.
Yeah, it's just, ripping the Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. There's a lot of shame involved, and that's usually what...
Yeah. So, we're talking about process, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so...
The thing, I suppose, would be the next procedural element that I do is I have a list of things I tend to avoid doing.
Like?
Well, for instance, I call it this literally, and in the lists that I write, it's called the things that I avoid doing when planning animation list. And that's a task on my task list. So I have to go and read that list and decide on a handful of those things to do. Because there's a bunch of stuff like, acting out reference earlier, taking my own expressions on the camera rather than just finding them on Pinterest, drawing the expressions out on model for the character, playing with the rig to make sure it can do all the expressions and poses that I need to do. All of that sort of stuff. And it takes time, and you don't always have that time, but if it's for a portfolio piece or it's for a personal project, you have that time.
Yeah. And I think...
my brain just sort of rolls off it like oil sometimes, so I have to, specify those things that I've noticed I tend to skip, because those are the things that are going to make the quality level higher at the end of the project.
I think process, it's almost synonymous with pipeline, to be honest with me. To be honest,
I think pipeline could be seen as more of like the technical application. I see where you're coming from, but there could be an argument saying as there are stuff like people whose job it is to be a pipeline technician that could be more like the software and the code and the project management, actual physical stuff around process. So I'll let you finish that sentence, but honestly for me I don't think they're synonymous, because I think pipeline is practically I'll do it in Maya and then I'll take it out and I'll paint the textures in Substance, that's pipeline.
Yeah, I think
process is more decisions and steps. In animation you've got your block out, you've got your blocking plus, you've got your spline and your polish. Those are steps in a process. Pipeline would be those things are happening in Maya and then getting rendered out with RenderMan.
I think probably synonymous was the wrong word to use, but I do think that they are heavily linked in a sense where...
Intertwined, certainly.
I think they are certainly heavily intertwined, where process is... You're sort of going through the process of, say, the conceptual process. That forms a part of your pipeline. So, like I said, if you're trying to come up with a new concept for, an asset or whatever, you have to go through this creative process every time to just generate that concept so that you can start the rest of the pipeline. And so, for me, what I find is a really helpful process is, maybe just sort of go find some references and all that sort of stuff, and, maybe do some little thumbnail sketches, then do a model, like, a rough model, then I'll screenshot paint over it, then I'll model a concept.
Can I bring in some fire here? Can I maybe cause some discourse and a little bit of
spice? Bring on the spice.
A bumpy road, bit of a spice, a little bit of fire.
Yeah, bring it on.
If it's not written down, you don't have a process.
Oh, bullshit.
If it's not written down, you do not have a process, because you will change it to what you think feels right at the time. Because you need to be able to trust that process, and you need to remove that as a decision-making element. Only
if you don't know what you're doing. If you're starting off and you don't know what you're doing, and you don't have a process, then you can make the argument that maybe you do need to write it down. But if it's something that you have been doing for a long time, then it doesn't need to be written down.
If you can't take that out of your brain and write it down without having to think about it, then it's the same thing. There's no exceptionalism for experience, because if a student can walk up to you, this is how we get teachers who go on all of these online web stores and stuff, who have like, I don't really know why I do this next step, I just kind of do it. And it's like the whole cutting off the end of the lamb. Do you know that one?
Sorry?
Where it's 3 generations of a family, whenever they're cooking a lamb roast, they cut off the end of the lamb roast before they put it in the oven. And they just always do this because their mother did it, their mother did it, their mother. They eventually go to the great-grandma and they're like, why do we do this? Why is this a thing that we do in our family? And she's like, I don't know why you do it, but my oven was too small to fit the lamb roast.
Right, yeah.
So if you can't write that down and justify every step, it's the same thing.
I don't think you need to write it down, though.
I don't think experience removes the need to have a written process, because I don't think you're that good.
I think that some people, they are able to develop a process by the act of doing. They don't have to write it down. Like I know I've met people where they've just always drawn, and yes, they probably have some legacy habits where it's like you could probably do without that, but it's still their process. It's not written down.
The ability to change your process when you encounter new information is very important. And I do not think you'll be able to do that as effectively if you cannot point at a part of it that you're trialing, that you're saying, this time around, I'm not going to do this bit, I'm going to do this instead.
No, that's not true. You don't have to do that. Because again, I can do stuff, a part of my process. My friends who do daily spit paints or whatever else, they will do things that are part of their process, and they'll go, look, I don't think that's working out for me. And then they will remove that part. It doesn't need to be written down.
I think that you're incorrect, and I think the thing is that maybe it doesn't need to be written down if it's at a certain level of simplicity, because that is easily containable in your head. But if you are holding all of that in your head without writing it down, then you are not as focused on what you need to be focused on, especially on a larger project with more moving parts. A spit paint is a spit paint. Sure, you might have been painting for however long and you've got your painting process down. But if you want to create a larger project with that, especially if it's something you have not done 1,000 times, if you're using a skill set to implement a process that you want to see a result for, and you haven't done it before, it needs to be written down.
I think that it doesn't have to be done for every single person. Like I managed to get through uni and develop my own process. And here's the thing, I'm not against writing it down. There was times where I would write things down and times where I wouldn't write things down. And, sometimes it helped and, sometimes I, didn't write it down and I did just fine. I tried out new processes or tried out new methods, shell some, got rid of some, took in some. Sometimes I wrote it down, sometimes I didn't. And here's the thing. It's just like...
Now, here's the thing.
Yeah?
I get that, and I get that you've got, in certain cases, a process that you don't feel like you need to refer to in order to do the same way. My point is that you will never be able to fully trust a process that you don't have written down, because the whole idea of a process is that you know it's the best way to do it. And the only way you can know it's the best way to do it is through iteration and completion. If you can't follow a process to the end and know exactly what steps you're taking to that end, the next time you go through that process, you can't make actual changes to it. You'll just know where the friction points are.
I think writing it down is not a bad idea. It's a good idea. But
I think
just
maybe
because
we're
it's
getting
written
hung up on the written down part.
But
I think
what you're talking about.
Quantified project. You need to have quantified it in some way. It can't just be this ephemeral thing that you think you know how to do.
Yeah. I think that what you're talking about is you're talking more about the lines of scrutiny. And I don't think it needs to be written down to scrutinize.
Alright, so...
Just because it's written doesn't...
If you have a process that you haven't written down and that you can't actively itemize, how are you ever going to delegate? How are you ever going to say, this is the way that I do it? Now that the project has gotten bigger, how are you going to bring somebody else in and have them do it your way?
Oh, I mean, it depends if you're wanting to bring somebody in. If you're wanting to bring someone in, you want to show someone else, then fine. But if you're not, it's just like, say you're doing...
teaching. If you're ever going to teach your process, it needs to be written down.
The
only way that you can get away with it not being written down is if there are no expectations of pipeline. You're the one who said pipeline and process were the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pipeline requires you to follow a strict written naming convention for everything so that it works. If they didn't write that down, everybody would have their own naming convention. It might work for them, but it's not collaborative. It's not going to work if everybody's naming, final X82.
Here's the thing. What I'm trying to say is just because it's not written down doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean you can't scrutinize it. Yes, that makes it easier to scrutinize, but it doesn't mean that it's not existent.
I would say that you have a habit and a skill set, but not a process.
Right. Because it's not written down, it's not scrutinized?
Because it's not shareable. A process should be objective. It should be, here is how you can go from 0 to 100. If you follow these steps, you will get from 0 to 100. But yes, you might have to have some skill to back that up. But if you have that skill and all the prerequisites, you can go from 0 to 100. That's a process, because you can go from start, thing doesn't exist, to complete, something does exist.
But it doesn't have to be written down. Someone can say, oh yeah, well I do this, and then I do this, and I do this, and I do this. And then they can scrutinize it as they go through it without writing it down.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree. Because
Here's the thing. I'm not saying that writing down is bad. Like, I agree that writing things down are good. Like, I do like to process things down. It's just, I'll agree to disagree, but I guess my final point is that it doesn't have to be written. You don't have to religiously write everything down all the time. My
final point is that a process is quantified. A feeling or something that is expected, or like it works this way because it's always worked this way, is not a process.
You don't have to. I don't think you have to write it down in order to say it hasn't always just been this way. Like you can say that it's this way because this way without writing it down.
I don't
Long
think
pause.
That you have it. I don't think you have a process at that point. I said that was the final thing I was going to say, and I'm going to stick to that.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Look, we'll agree to disagree. A bit of co-host banter. There you go.
What's your next step? Once you've got your process written
once
down
you've got
or
your process,
remembered in great detail.
Yes. Well, yeah, I suppose at that point it's more habitual, but once you've done that, it becomes, a lot more execution, I suppose, more of the technical pipeline execution. It's like, okay, cool, I've got my plan. Now it's time to execute. So,
right.
So for me,
step to execution. How do you get?
Actually, yes,
how do you
that's
move from theoretical to
okay.
implementation?
That's right. I completely forgot that I was actually explaining my process, and then we tangented hardcore. Anyway, so what I do is I'll, do a bit of research, do some thumbnail sketches. Then I'll, do like a sort of grey box model, take a screenshot, paint over in Photoshop, and then I'll, refine the model a little bit more, and then I'll take another screenshot and I'll paint over it again.
I get that as your model workflow, but my question is, how do you go from the theoretical once you have your plan in place, whether it's written down or not?
Yeah.
How do you go from that theoretical concept of here's what it's going to be to now I am working on it? What is that transition point? What does that look like?
I have been thinking about this a bit, and it's a bit hard for me to pin down, because what I do is I will do these kind of back and forth of paint over model, paint over model, paint over model, paint over model. And then once I get my paint over to a level of detail that I'm happy with, that it's a decently rendered concept where it gives me a clear plan of what I want to do. It's like, okay, I've got my form, I've got my colors, I've got my shading / value. Once I have that, then I can go, cool, now it's time to take this further. And so then that's the point where I'll do the full model, and then I'll start, to unwrap, and then...
Okay, yeah, but you said you model and then you paint over.
Mm-hmm.
Between theoretical and finished model, or at least finished first.
When you say theoretical, are you saying...
You've got your process, you know what you're going to do. You've understood the project that you're setting out upon.
Mm-hmm.
You've got your pack on your back and your walking stick in hand.
Going on an adventure.
What's the first step out the front door?
Open Blender.
Right. So do you set up a project? Do you set up is it like an environment? You figure out what you're going to need? Do you get
that's all figured
into
out.
A mental state, or...
Okay, now it's getting real hard to figure out what you're asking. Like, are you asking, am I going to do like a bit of meditation, set up some herbs and get myself in a mindset, maybe some tea?
Hey, Mr. Wim Hof, before you get too far down that road, it's not that hard a question. I'm just asking, when you sat down, you said, I am feeling creative. I want to make a project. It will be this project.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I have decided that this will be the project. Now I am going to begin.
Mm-hmm.
How do you begin? What is your process for beginning?
I can't really say that I have a process for beginning, other than you've just got to do it. It's just once you've got your process of the creative concept, you go, all right, well, it's time to shift into the production phase. So you've got the concept phase and you've got the production phase. It's time to sort of acknowledge, all right, production phase time.
What does the concept phase look like? What are you doing? What are you getting out of that?
So what I'm getting out of it is I'm getting the roadmap for the production. So the process that I painted before,
to go from blank canvas through to this is now what it's going to look like and what I'm going to iterate on.
It was what I said just before. I start off with, I'll write down, for me, I like to write down sort of, say I want to do a prop, right? I was doing this yesterday. So I'll write down a list of like things that I could potentially do, like just random props. And then I'll sort of pick a word from it. And then I'll, go on Google, go on Pinterest, whatever. I'll just like start taking a bunch of reference images, just a bunch of ideas, sticking them on Pure Ref. And then I'll do some thumbnails, just like quick little black images. I might sort of polish one a little bit, maybe. And then I'll do a bit of modeling, just to kind of see it a bit more in 3D. Then I'll take a screenshot. I'll paint it over in Photoshop. Then I'll model it a little bit more according to that. And I'll do that back and forth between Photoshop and modeling until I get it to a level where I'm fairly happy with the form
How do you know when you're happy?
When I feel like it's something where it's just like it's not something that you can really quantify. For me, it's something where you just kind of, it feels right when I tick these boxes of volume, shape, the silhouette looks good. I have an idea. I have an idea.
Artistic principles are coming in. And
it's like
more emotional and feeling based.
Yeah, where it's just like, okay, I've got my colors, I've got my values, I've got this 2D concept in Photoshop, because that's where the end result is. The model that I've done in Blender is not the final part of it. Like, I can use that further, but the goal is what happens in Photoshop. The goal is to have an image with the correct value. I've got a color palette. That's super important to have the color palette. I've got, the shape and the silhouettes and the form, all of those art principles there that I will need. Those are like the building blocks. That is the roadmap. So the conceptual phase is building the roadmap so that the production phase can follow that roadmap. So then you've done that.
How do you know when you're done?
When I'm done?
Yes.
I don't think that it's really something that you can say, well, this is done.
When do you abandon the project? When do you go from this is not completed to if I stop now, I'm happy to put it on ArtStation?
Oh, okay. Right. I understand what you're saying now. I'd say a pretty good indication for me of when this isn't just like when a project is done generally, but this is also maybe it's time to move on to the next phase, is when I'm rotating around my project. Like I've got my concept there, and the concept, it looks, pretty close to the concept, and I'm sort of just rotating around going, okay, what next? And then I'm just like going in, I'm just like finicking these tiny little things. And it's usually about 20 minutes after that where I go, I think I'm done. And that's generally how things wind up.
Nothing's standing out.
Yeah, it's kind of like and this isn't just in terms of when you're at the end of a project. This is just, maybe you're in a phase of a project at the moment. Say I'm doing a paint over, and, I'm just kind of, at this point, I'm just zooming in and I'm like panning over things. I'm like, okay, I've got to fix that and just straighten that line up a tiny bit. It's just like to the point where it's just like, you're starting to finesse things. It's like, okay, well, it's time to go back into Blender and implement these changes that I've just made from this concept. And
then how do you make a differentiation between it is technically finished and I've got everything that I'm going to get out of this exercise from this step? Because technically finished would take a longer time. And if it's past the point where you've gotten everything you're going to get out of it towards the larger project, there's going to be wasted time between those two.
In terms of, I've gotten everything out of it, of like personal artistic development.
Well, no, you've got a goal for what you're doing, right? You're doing the paint over because there's something that you want to hash in quickly that you can't just put on the model that you want to visualize.
Mm-hmm.
Do you take that through to a final painting because it needs to be a final painting, or do you just get it to a point where you're starting to be able to visualize how it's going to look on the model?
Oh, right. Yeah, okay, I understand what you're asking. This is something that varies for a lot of people. For me, I don't like to do a super polished idea, because there are things where if you over detail it, then chances are that once you get to that point, you're going to have to change that anyway. So if you're going in there and you're manually deciding like every single grain on the wood, you could get to doing the wood grain texture painting, and you could go, oh, actually no, now that I've got it in 3D, it should be this way. And all that time spent doing wood grain painting is kind of wasted time. So you can just indicatively put them in there.
Spend more time exploring up front so that you've tried a couple of things and which one's going to work better?
Yeah, I mean, by all means, it's something that depends from person to person and, what they personally prefer. I do like to try out some variations of things. Like, okay, what does, this hue look like? And okay, that's all right, put another layer in and, try another hue, other hues and other saturations and whatever else, or, try other patterns and things, and I'll try that out. But there gets to a point where it's just like, if you're spending too long on it, say you're spending, like, you spent half an hour is definitely too long on just, the grain of a wood. Like, for the grain of a wood, it's like, in a concept, what I'm talking about, in the grain of a wood, if you're spending...
Yeah, but that's obvious that's a waste of time, but how do you know, especially in the less cut and dry areas, when you've moved into that space rather than just exploring?
As in, I've moved into the next phase of time to move on?
Yeah, you've moved into the phase where you're just doing it because it's there. You're not exploring, you're just sort of over-detailing. How do you know when you've transitioned out of an exploratory phase and you're just putting in detail that's going to get wasted?
Usually, I don't like to be too precious with it, so I'll leave my mind, a bit scrappy, and I'll kind of just, be zooming. I try and zoom out a lot, so I can try and see it like at a small level. Because if you're zooming in too much, you're finessing too much about that line's not completely straight. So I'm zooming out. I'm looking at it at a smaller scale, and so once I zoom in too much, then it's like, okay, this is just too much finessing. I'm happy with it. When I'm zoomed out, I think that looks pretty good. Obviously, if I zoom in, there's going to be things that I don't like. So it's usually once I get to that point where I'm like, I suppose time to jump back into Blender or whatever the next stage I'm up to.
So for you, it's a level of detail beyond your optimal viewing angle.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, what's the point in just zooming in on a concept and doing every sort of little grain perfectly? Maybe that suits your goal because maybe you want to show those concepts in your portfolio. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But for me,
so it does come back to goal setting. It's you need to have decided how you want this thing to be presented.
I mean,
that decision informs the process.
I mean, not just that. It's yes, that, but also some people just work better by having a really polished concept. Some people, not everyone needs to do that, and some people just want to move on from that sooner and get into the production phase faster.
Well, which do you think is more valuable?
Depends on the individual, really. Personally, I think a roadmap, a concept that is at at the higher end of polished, but not polished to the point where it's like, chuck this in the portfolio, because A, I'm not looking to put concepts in my portfolio, and B, I want to move on from that phase a little bit sooner than, fully concepting it out, because I want to get something done in about, I want to get my prop out in, say, 3 days. And so I'm not going to spend all that time. Concepting is not, it's not what I'm there for. It's a part of my process.
Okay. So that's a linear process, right? Start to finish. How would you go about rationalizing when it's less linear than that, when a process becomes a bit more three-dimensional? Because when you think about the way content is consumed nowadays, people, A, want more content, but they also want behind-the-scenes stuff. They want, documentary stuff. They want tutorials on how to do it themselves, and they want assets. When you're doing a project, does the process necessarily change if you're trying to make it larger than the result?
What do you mean when you're trying to make it larger than the result? Like, as in, you're trying to make the project larger than what you normally work with? Right?
If you've got a artifact for your portfolio, you've got an asset that you've worked on, and you're putting it in your portfolio, and that's all you're going to do to get a portfolio and apply it to a studio position. That is that process. For any other application, like if you want to do a tutorial on how you did the process for that thing, if you want to put it in an asset pack to sell it, if you want to do other content surrounding the production of the way you do things and your actual process, which is, let's be frank, the only way that you actually get eyeballs on your work these days. Does that change the process inherently while you do it, or is that an additive layer?
I think it's an additive layer. What do you reckon?
I think it does affect the end result, because if you have to decide what the actual product is, because you could be doing say you want to have a YouTube channel and you want to do tutorials on how to create something, right?
Yep, I'm listening.
The end asset has to look good enough that people want to watch the tutorial, but it has to be quick enough that you can get that tutorial out and move on to the next tutorial, because that's now your business model, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think coming down to that goal setting, like, is it going in your portfolio, or is that what it's being used for? Is it worth trying to unify multiple streams in order to have multiple end results of the goal? Or is it worth having one process from which you can pull out elements and use them in different places?
Here's my opinion on it. I think that no one's process is really going to be exactly the same. It's just, you can't take someone's one for one and do it. Like, you can have it very close, but everyone's going to have their preferred methods. So in the example of, say, YouTube channel, I'd say, show the process, but strip it down. You don't need to show, okay, now I'm going back. I'm going back again. I'm going back again. Like, you can just kind of gloss over that and sort of, be a bit more narrative.
My point is, do you have to go in the outset with that in mind? Or do you make something which represents the core content and then find out ways to utilize it? Do you have to go in with a plan to use it in multiple ways? Or can you then go back over it as long as you're documenting and have other processes that sort of tangent out on that after the fact? I guess it's sort of like, does it have to happen all at once, or can it happen asynchronously? The reason I'm asking is that because it's processed, right? And this is the way that most people consume content these days. And at a certain level, an artist has to have their work seen, and content production is the way that you get eyeballs on your work. Even if it's still just, if your aim is to get into a studio somewhere, you need eyeballs on your work. You need to have been seen, and you need people to be like, oh, you're the guy who did ... Is that part of that whole process? Is that a project?
I think
that two separate processes?
I don't know. I think that's probably like an addition, layers added to it, where it's like, okay, now I've got to have my process of putting things out there, or whatever it is in particular that you're doing. For me, it would be building up the layer of social media engagement. Okay, I've done this, post online or whatever. I'd say your process is your process. Scrutinize it, obviously.
Scrutinize it theoretically, because you don't need it written down.
Yeah. No, I still stand by that. I don't think you have to write it down. Like, if it's not written, okay, let's not get back into that. But we don't want to go back down there. But
sort of where I'm getting at is that, like, of course, not everybody's out there trying to be the number one YouTube content creator. Not everybody's out there trying to be, TikTok super mega sensation. But the common wisdom is that you have to utilize these platforms to get attention, because it's an attention economy. Should we be building into the projects, because we know that that's something that has to happen if success is our goal? Success, quotation marks, .exe. If that's your goal, do you need to build that into your process? Or is that a separate process that you sort of need to run parallel to the creation process?
Don't know.
I'm trying to find the borders between creation, documentation, and performance.
Yeah, look, honestly, that's something I don't know, and I can only sort of speculate on. My inkling is that you'll probably have to have say if you want to do animation, you'll probably have to have a process for putting yourself, for documenting or putting each project out there to make sure it gets seen. I think that it wouldn't necessarily change, say, your animation process, but it would be interwoven into that. It's like you have your process which is based around your main creative process.
Yeah.
So it's something that it runs parallel, but it kind of intertwines at, certain points.
It's just a question that I'm encountering at the moment personally, because it seems like it's impossible just to work as a professional. It does seem like these days you do have to be a bit of a professional and a performer just to exist, because even it's not you're on social media or you're not on social media. It's if you're not on social media, you don't exist.
Honestly, I think that you don't have to. It definitely is. I think it makes it way easier to get a job if you have a good social media presence. But, there is still every chance that if you want to get a job in a studio, if you send in your CV and your portfolio, then there is every chance that you can get that job. Yes, someone else with a higher social media presence has an advantage on that sense, but I don't think...
Well, let's say you're an illustrator or something. They're going to immediately say, what's your Instagram? I'll check out your Instagram.
Yeah.
Well, at that point, if you say, I don't have an Instagram, but I have a portfolio website, here's http:// randompowdermonkey.com. At that point, you're creating friction. So is that...
I think
is that beneficial, or is it the baseline?
I think it's the baseline. I think that it's the baseline in which you can get a job. I think that having a social media presence where you can go, here's my Instagram at Jayden.ray, follow me, I think that is a good way to, increase your chances, but it's not the be all end all, you've got to do this to get a job. You can definitely just have a website, do it the 2005 way of just your website, your email, and your CV, and then that's it. You can do it, but the game has changed in that where, people that do have a social media presence, they're just going to have an advantage.
Because I think about process, right? We're talking about process.
Mm-hmm.
That can be boiled down to, okay, I don't have a 3D game asset created, and then zoom ahead 40 hours or whatever. I do have a 3D game asset created. That is a process. But it's not really what people mean when they ask, what's your process, right? They don't mean, then you click this button, then you bake the maps, then you da-da-da-da-da. They're like, oh, so what's your process? They're sort of asking, what's your deal? What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, what sort of art do you do? It's like, what's the end result? Is that what you're saying?
Kind of. It's sort of like, where are the boundaries of process? Does process... Because we even said at the beginning of this podcast, process includes when you wake up, right? It's like, you wake up at a time, or at least you try to wake up at a time. You try to get a certain amount of productivity done. You know that you need to chill a certain amount, so you do something fun. You've got other responsibilities. That's process. So shouldn't your, the marketing of your work and the visibility of you as an artist be part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a strength to do that. And I think that, you don't have to, but personally, I would suggest that you should probably market yourself online if, say, your goal is to get a job at Pixar. You should probably try and market yourself, because then that means that a recruiter is more likely to just stumble upon you and go, no, yeah. See if he wants a job.
This is where I make it a bit circuitous by saying, then, is that targeting work towards somebody else's preference again? This is how we got down onto the aesthetics argument. It's like, okay, then a large part of your process is externally focused in order to appeal to somebody against your immediate inclination for your best long-term interest?
I think you can probably have the thing that you do, and that's what you do. That's just your thing, right? But then you can have something external, say, a process to put yourself out there. I think that you can absolutely separate those two, where you have a process to pull your target audience in.
Yeah. See, the way I visualize it, it's sort of like, can you imagine a bunch of concentric circles?
Mm-hmm.
Except they're sort of almost touching on one side as they get smaller, right? Have you seen those where the circle gets smaller, but they're always the same distance apart on one side? So as they get smaller, it's not towards the center, it's sort of towards like a random point towards the left or to the bottom.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And they're spinning with a dot on them, right? And so whenever one of those dots hits a certain point on that circle is the rapidity of your process. And so processes are a certain size and a certain length. You might be spending 40 hours on a project, but you might have a weekly social media plan, right?
Yep.
And so that plan is going to iterate 4 times every month for the monthly thing that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Is it worth knowing the different cycles of that in your process? Is it worth knowing, like, I have a process for the year? Or should it be more contained from your own perspective? Like, from where I am, here's where I go.
I want to say something, but I really don't know.
Does it make sense, the question?
Yeah, it does. And I don't know how to answer it. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
To be honest, I don't either. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah,
This is the struggle I'm facing at the moment when making these processes and these plans, is that I think if I did account for those cycles where it's like, you know, if I have for instance, we record this podcast weekly, so we're always in this cycle of recording date. For me, it's editing. Then for you, it's the marketing, and then it's the podcast drop, right?
Yeah.
That is a weekly cycle.
Mm.
That's easy to quantify. But if you've got cycles that go for 4 months each, keeping track of that mentally is a lot harder. And I feel like maybe that's where the leverage in a process comes from, is if you can quantify the different levels of size of what you want to be part of your overall process.
Yeah, well, I think that, say you've got your larger thing, right? Your 4 monthly thing. If you're able to break that 4 monthly thing down into smaller things, if it is possible to do so, then that becomes less of a 4 monthly thing and more of a milestone. Does that make sense?
And a milestone is part of your long-term goal, or is that part of a process towards a project?
It's part of your milestone process and a long-term goal, you know. Take it whichever way you want.
So you'd say that your life is kind of the main project. You've got a life process, and then you sort of break it back down to where you are currently.
Yeah, I suppose. Look, if anyone has any input on this, like, drop a comment and let us know what you think.
Yeah, no, I would be interested to find other people's input on that, definitely, because, for instance, 6 months ago me would have no idea. If he was to drop into the future and see me now, he'd have no idea what I was doing compared to what he is doing. And you could probably do that every 6 months back for maybe like 4 to 6 years.
Yeah.
No 6-month version of myself sees the person that they recognized as themselves in their 6 month in the future version of me.
Okay. What do you think 6 months ago Kris would be doing now, and what do you think 6 months in the future Kris will be doing?
Well, I have no idea what 6 months in the future Kris would be, because if we go back 6 months, I'm getting married. So 6 months ago me wasn't married.
Yep.
So if he jumps forward, though he probably has an inkling that it's happening, because that would have been within that time frame, he doesn't have any context of what it looks like or feels like to be me, right? I'm just saying that, like, if you go back another 6 months, I'm working in a school, as like the media officer come IT guy.
Mm.
If you go back another 6 months, what am I doing? I am doing the, first COVID deployment of a fleet of Chromebooks, like that was my job back then. And then before that, I was working at I was freelancing. Then before that, I was working at the university. You go back in these 6-month increments, and you can see your path from there to here.
Mm.
And that's a path, but it's not a process. It's not like you made choices to do those things. And all of the choices I've made up until this point, I would like to say, have been fairly deliberate, apart from the stuff that you can't have control over, like, for instance, pandemics and lockdowns and that sort of thing.
Mm. I think that...
But
go on.
It's not a process, Because you from there can't anticipate where you'll be in 6 months. How do you make a process for that becoming comfortable with ambiguity? And at what point do you start implementing processes and removing that ambiguity? And at which point do you just say, well, I don't know, I can't anticipate it, so I don't need a process for it?
Okay, so my thoughts on this is that you have your goals. Say it's a big goal, it's a long-term goal, right? You slice it up into smaller goals, achievable goals. And then if those goals are still a bit big, you slice them up again. And then you have a process for executing those goals, and it's a series of mini goals which are part of all the same goals. And so that's where the process comes from. So you've got these...
And you don't feel like you need to write this down? Because I feel like I'd forget immediately.
No, I'm a very in my head person, and this is something that I've held this opinion of for a while. That's my opinion on it. I still write down goals. Like, don't get me wrong, but in terms of you have like a long-term goal, you slice it up, and then you have your process for executing those goals. That's not something I feel like I need to write down.
Is your long-term goal right now the same as it was 6 months ago?
No.
So technically then you're not following a process, because you made a process and then ignored it because the goal changed.
Oh, yeah. I'm like you. My goals are changing all the time.
So my point is, like, wouldn't it be easier to not have that certainty of the goal out to a certain level of ambiguity and just have general intentions? And then it's the difference between, like, laying down a path ahead of you and then realizing that you've laid it down in the wrong way versus holding out a really long stick. It's like kind of awkward and it's wobbling around the place, but if you turn, at least the stick turns with you, right?
Okay, here's the thing. I think we'll have to wrap this up soon because it's getting a bit long. But here's the thing: like you have to have a goal, because if you don't have a goal, then you don't have any direction. You don't have any sort of responsibility, and that is kind of like a spiral into bad headspace, right?
I do agree with that.
You do need to have general goals, and those goals will give you some order and some structure in your life, right?
So is the long-term goal more for you at the time that you're making it than the person who you expect to be when you reach the goal?
Yeah, it's like more for me who I am now, but also kind of for me in the future. So it's like you have these goals and then you work towards them. You have to accept that your goals have to be fluid, because if you set your mind on something and you're like, this is never going to change, this is always going to be, then I'd say that's probably a form of arrogance and sort of blindness, so that if you have to accept that you're going to fail, and you have to kind of, determine what failure looks like, and then you have to, sort of say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do when I fail. This is how I'm going to handle it. And, you can't figure out exactly what it will be when you fail. You can't determine preemptively, what you're going to do, but even just the acknowledge and the acceptance and a general indication of failure is a good way to know when that's going to when it's happening. Because if you fail, like, it'll happen whether or not you've sort of thought about it. And I think I've said this before on the pod, but if you have thought about it, then you're going to recognize when you're failing. And so there has to be some sort of rigidity in that you have to have a plan to follow, but it does need to have a sort of fluidity that when some chaos comes along, you can, reorganize that, because chaos, I don't think it's not a bad thing necessarily. This pandemic is very chaotic, but in my personal life, there is some really good elements to this. Like, it has thrown my life completely in chaos, but there is ways for me to go, okay, I'm able to shift my end goal a little bit because of this chaos.
The churn breeds mobility.
Yeah, so if you're too stuck in order, then things can become rigid, and maybe that's good, but sometimes that's bad. And chaos can bring opportunity. It's being able to recognize when there is opportunity.
So, if I were to summarize it, would it be loyalty to the goal, but flexibility in the method, and then accounting for that flexibility in any process? Yes,
and honestly, there's no, like, here's how you do exactly. It's one of those things where it's like, you're not going to learn until it hits you. And like, that sucks, but it's just the way it is. Like, the only way you're going to learn is through trial of fire.
You know what the most frustrating way to learn is? When you've heard the same advice like 11 times before, but then it becomes contextual and it hits you. And you remember all the other times you've heard that advice and it didn't apply or it didn't make sense.
Yes, like, the power of hindsight, hey? And like, you've heard the advice. Something is happening. And you're like, oh my God, what's happening? And then afterwards you're like, I see now.
Hindsight is 2021.
Unfortunately. So,
do you think? How about this? How about, I'm going to call it now. I reserve the right to backflip on this.
Okay.
Completely by next week. But how about becoming comfortable with ambiguity as a topic for the next pod?
What was the other one we're going to talk about as well? Like, we put a pin in?
Yeah, I'll have to listen back to it in the edit, and then we'll make a choice between the two. How about that?
Okay, alright. I'm down for that.
Cool.
Alright.
Mr. Jayden, where can people go to find you on the internet?
You can find me at Twitter at JSTO_art, or you can find me on Instagram at Jayden.Ray, spelled R-A-I. Where can they find you, Kris?
You can find me at animatorkris anywhere on the internet.
Thanks for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe. See ya.
Bye. The introduction thing isn't entirely laziness. It is like 60% laziness, but it's also 40% like the consistency of the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't know. How do you feel about that? Because you hear the intro music, and then you're sort of expecting to hear something comes next. And if instead of your silky dulcet tones, I come in and crow warble my way through it, people aren't really gonna have the same experience.
True. Alright, I'll give it a shot, see what I can do for the morning. Hopefully I don't wake my housemate up. Alright.
Go slow and easy. And then it'll sound like ASMR.
Sit down and relax. It'll be over soon.
That's gross. Anyway.
Chuck that in at the end.
ASMR Jayden edition.
Yeah. I reckon someone might fall asleep to that.
Oh, yeah. Or not fall asleep.
Nightmares.
Yeah, that's what I meant.